My name is Maya Ellison. I'm 39 years old. I'm a project manager in Seattle, Washington. And 3 years after cutting contact with my entire family, I sat down at a restaurant table, waited for the right moment, and whispered 2 sentences to a waiter that changed the entire evening. 15 minutes later, my father stopped smiling. The family had been celebrating for over an hour before that moment. Wine poured, lobster ordered, my brother already discussing dessert with the confidence of a man who has never once in his adult life received a bill he expected to pay himself. My mother making the face she makes at family gatherings when she wants everyone to understand how happy she is. Wide, warm, deliberate, the expression of a woman performing the role of the woman she wants people to believe she is. My father sat at the head of the table like a man who had already won. 17 people, $4,700 in food and wine ordered before I arrived. And then the waiter walked toward my father with a folder and an expression that had nothing to do with happiness. That was the moment my father realized the bill wasn't the only thing waiting for him. If your family has ever confused love with access to your wallet, stay with me. Drop your first name and your city in the comments. Subscribe before we go any further because the 2 sentences I whispered to that waiter are the end of a 3-year story that starts much earlier than the restaurant. Now let me take you back to before the no contact, before the invitation, before the dinner. I am a senior project manager at a logistics technology firm. I have been doing this work for 14 years. I am good at it in the specific way of someone who learned early that systems either function or they don't, that the difference between a functioning system and a broken one is usually not complexity, but consistency, and that the person responsible for the system does not get to have bad days when the deadline is real. I paid for my own education. I moved to Seattle at 24 with $1,100 and a job offer, and built a life there the way you build anything that actually holds, slowly, carefully, without anyone else's money or endorsement or safety net. My family lived 4 hours south in a mid-sized city in Oregon where they had lived my entire life, where my parents had owned the same house since 1987, where my brother Todd had moved back after his second divorce, and where the family's financial weather changed constantly, and the person they called when the storm arrived was me. Not because I was the oldest. Todd is 3 years older. Because I had money and Todd had needs, and somewhere along the way those 2 facts had calcified into a family arrangement that nobody had formally decided on, and nobody had ever been willing to formally discuss. Let me show you what the arrangement looked like in practice. 2014. My father's truck needed a transmission replacement. $4,000. He called on a Sunday and described it the way he described every financial problem. Not as a request, as a briefing on a situation that needed resolving and that I was being informed of because I was the relevant party. I paid it. He said he appreciated it. The money was not repaid. It was also never mentioned again, which I understood to mean it had been reclassified internally from loan to gift without my participation in that reclassification. 2016. Todd's second divorce produced a legal bill he could not cover, $1,800. He called and used the word temporarily, which I had learned by then was the word my family used when they meant permanently but wanted to preserve the fiction of repayment. I paid it. He said he'd get it back to me by summer. It was not summer yet when he started calling me selfish 3 years later. 2017. My mother needed a dental procedure that her insurance covered partially. She called and described it the way she described everything she needed from me, with a softness in her voice that was not quite sadness, but was designed to produce the response that sadness would produce, which was compliance without discussion. I covered the gap. $1,100. She said I was a good daughter. It was the warmest she had been to me in years. It lasted until the next thing, 2018. My parents' water heater, my father's hospital copay, Todd's car insurance lapse, which had consequences I was asked to help address. I tracked these. Not obsessively, the way I track everything, because tracking is how I maintain clarity about systems, and the family financial system was one I had been asked to participate in without being given the full picture of its structure. By the end of 2018, I had given or lent, without repayment, approximately $22,000 to my family over the preceding decade. The number itself was not what broke me. What broke me was understanding, with the specific clarity that comes from finally looking at a number you have been avoiding looking at, that I had been the answer to every question they had about money, and the answer to none of the questions I had about whether I was loved for anything other than my ability to be the answer. My mother called it the Family Emergency Fund. She used the phrase once, at Thanksgiving 2018, in front of everyone, referring to me in the third person while I was sitting 3 feet away. She said, "Isn't it nice to know we have a family emergency fund?" And she looked at me when she said it with the specific warmth of someone who believes a compliment and an extraction are the same thing. I finished my turkey. I drove home to Seattle. I did not call for 3 weeks. Nobody called me either. This was also information. The incident that ended the contact happened in March of 2019. Todd had gotten into a business venture with a man I did not know well, a real estate investment scheme that had the specific hallmarks of a bad idea at every level I could assess from the outside: undercapitalized, poorly structured, dependent on market conditions that were already shifting. I had said so once the previous fall, when Todd described it at a family dinner with the enthusiasm of a man who has convinced himself this time is different. He had told me I was always negative. My mother had said I didn't know everything about business. My father had said Todd had good instincts. By March, the venture had collapsed. Todd owed money to 3 parties. One of them was making aggressive contact about repayment. Todd called me on a Tuesday evening and described the situation in the briefing format I had come to recognize. Not a request, a briefing on a situation that needed resolving. He told me he needed $38,000. I told him no. I said it the way I say things when I have decided them. Clearly, without excessive explanation, without the softening that implies the decision is negotiable. Todd told me I was being selfish. He said it without hesitation, the way people say things they have decided are true and have been waiting for the right moment to use. My mother called 2 hours later. Her voice had the quality it had when she had been discussing something with my father before calling, the specific cadence of someone presenting a prepared position rather than having a spontaneous conversation. She said the family needed to be able to count on each other. She said no one was asking for charity, they were asking for family support. She said I had more than enough, and it wasn't like I was going to miss it. I'm not going to miss it. That sentence. I had been giving this family money for a decade, and the frame they had built around it was that I had so much it wouldn't be missed. Not that they were grateful, not that they understood what it had taken to build the position I was in, that I had enough that extraction from it was basically consequence-free. My father called an hour after my mother. He said the word loyalty. He said it twice. He said a family that couldn't depend on each other wasn't a family. He said I needed to think about what I actually valued. I told him I was clear about what I valued. I told them all, in 3 separate calls over that Tuesday evening, that I would not be giving Todd $38,000, that I would not be giving anyone in the family money going forward, and that I needed some time away from the family dynamic to think about what I wanted the relationship to look like. Nobody called it what it was, no contact, because I didn't use that language. I just stopped answering. The calls came for about 2 weeks, then they stopped. 3 years passed. I built those 3 years the way I had built everything else, methodically, without a safety net, paying attention to what actually mattered. My career stabilized into something I was proud of. I bought an apartment in Capitol Hill. I had a small group of friends who knew me without needing me to be the answer to anything. I ran 3 days a week along the waterfront and thought about the specific quiet of a life that had stopped producing the ambient noise of managing someone else's expectations. I was not happy in a simple way. It was more specific than that. I was clear. I knew what the day was going to require of me, and the requirement was reasonable, and I could meet it and go to sleep and start again. That was what I had been missing for 36 years without knowing that was what I was missing. My mother called on a Thursday afternoon in late October. Not my father. My mother. on a number I had not blocked because I had not wanted the decision to feel more permanent than it needed to be, because some part of me had understood that the door needed to be left open, even if I was the only one managing its position. Her voice was different from the voice she had used for the 3 calls in March of 2019. Those calls had the prepared quality I described. This call had something else, something that sounded on the surface like genuine softness, like the voice of a woman who had arrived at something over 3 years that she had not been at before. She said she missed me. She said life was too short for this. She said she and Dad had been talking, and they wanted to make things right, and they wanted to see me. She said they wanted to be a family again. I listened to all of it. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think people expect that 3 years of no contact produces a person who is immune to this kind of call, and I was not immune. I had not spoken to my mother in 3 years. She was my mother. There was something in her voice that reached past the analysis, past the history of documented extractions, past the $22,000, and it's not like you're going to miss it, and found the 9-year-old who had wanted her mother to see her for reasons that had nothing to do with what she could provide. I said I would think about it. She said they wanted to take me to dinner, somewhere nice, her treat. She said the name of a restaurant in Portland, an upscale steakhouse I had heard of, the kind of place with a prix-fixe menu and a wine list that requires knowledge to navigate, and a bill that requires confidence or company money to receive without flinching. She said just the 3 of us, just family. I told her I would let her know. I did not call my therapist, which I should have done, before making any decision about this. I called my closest friend instead, a woman named Sandra, who has known me for 11 years, and who said with the directness she always brings to questions about my family, "What are you hoping to get from this?" I thought about it. I said I wanted to know if anything had changed. Sandra said that was a reasonable thing to want to know. She said to keep my expectations calibrated. She said to drive separately. I said I would. I called my mother back the next day and said yes. I had no idea, saying yes, that the yes was not going to be for dinner with 3 people. I drove to Portland on a Saturday evening in November. 4 hours down I-5 with a podcast I did not retain, and the specific ambient noise of a decision I had already made but was still examining from multiple angles, the way you examine a structural choice after you have already committed to it, not to reverse it, just to understand it fully. Sandra had said drive separately. I had driven separately. My car was in the restaurant parking lot rather than at my parents' house, which meant my exit from the evening was entirely my own to manage. This was a small thing that turned out to matter. I had dressed for a dinner with my parents, not formally, not casually, the specific middle register of someone who wants to look composed without appearing to have tried too hard to look composed. Dark pants, a blouse I had bought the previous winter that fit correctly, shoes I could walk in for several hours if the evening required leaving quickly. I had looked at the restaurant's menu online before driving down. The prix-fixe was 3 courses, reasonably priced for the caliber of the place. The a la carte had larger numbers, premium steaks, whole lobster, king crab, seafood towers, but for 3 people having a conversation dinner, those options were unlikely to dominate the bill. I had formed an estimate of what the evening would cost. I had been wrong about almost everything else, but I had at least been trying to calculate something real. The restaurant was exactly what it looked like online. Dark wood, warm lighting, the kind of quiet that comes from expensive sound absorption materials, and a clientele that does not need to speak loudly to feel important. A hostess who looked at reservations with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. I gave my name. She looked at her screen. Something moved across her expression that I would not fully understand for another hour. She said the rest of the party was already seated and she would take me back. The rest of the party, not my mother and father, the rest of the party. I followed her through the dining room toward the private section at the back, separated from the main floor by frosted glass panels, the kind of space restaurants reserve for parties that have a specific size and a specific budget and a specific expectation of privacy. She opened the door. 17 people looked up. I want to describe this moment accurately because I think the gap between what I expected and what I found is the part that tells you everything about how my family operates. I found my parents at the head of the table, my father in his good jacket, my mother in the dress she wore to occasions she had organized in advance and wanted to feel significant. I also found Todd and his girlfriend whose name I would not remember by the end of the evening, my mother's sister Brenda and Brenda's husband Carl, 3 cousins on my mother's side, my father's brother Ray and Ray's wife Donna, 3 more cousins from that branch, a family friend named Charles who had known my parents since the 90s and whom I had not seen since a Christmas party approximately 7 years earlier. 2 people I did not immediately recognize who turned out, when I processed things later, to be neighbors my parents had been friendly with for several years. 17 people, the table was full of food, not in the process of being ordered, full. Plates at various stages, a seafood tower in the center that had clearly been the first thing ordered and was now partially consumed, 3 open bottles of wine, what appeared to be a ribeye in front of my father's place, king crab legs near my mother's end, appetizer plates that had been cleared but had left the specific residue of recent consumption. They had been here for a while. 1 empty seat, my seat. At the middle of one side of the long table, not at either end, not positioned for conversation with my parents, positioned for maximum visibility to the group. My father stood when I walked in. He opened his arms. He said, "There she is." I want to describe what I did in those first few seconds because it is the decision that made everything else possible. I did not leave, not because I couldn't. My car was in the parking lot. My exit was entirely my own. Sandra had told me to drive separately exactly so that I retained this option. I could have turned around in the doorway and walked back through the dining room and out to the parking lot and driven 4 hours home, and that would have been a reasonable response to what I was looking at. I did not leave because I was not yet certain what I was looking at. This sounds naive, and I want to be honest that in some way it was. But I have spent 14 years in project management, and the first rule of any situation that has changed from its expected parameters is that you assess before you act. You do not respond to surprise by assuming the worst interpretation immediately. You gather information. You understand the actual shape of what you are dealing with before you commit to a response. I also did not leave because I was watching my father open his arms and beam at me with the specific warmth he deployed when he wanted something, and I wanted to understand what he wanted badly enough to stay for the conversation. I sat down. A waiter materialized immediately and handed me a menu. I opened it. I looked at the a la carte section. I noted the numbers. I noted what was already on the table. I did the math in my head the way I do all math, quickly, without drama, just the number as a number. The seafood tower alone was $240. The king crab legs were market price, which the waiter had described to someone as $180 per pound, and the serving appeared to be at least 2 pounds. 3 ribeyes visible at various points around the table, each listed at $95. The wine, 3 open bottles, a 4th being poured, ran from $90 to $160 per bottle on the list. I was approximately 12 minutes into being in the room, and I could already see that the table was carrying somewhere north of $3,000 in ordered items, with an evening still underway. I had not ordered anything. My menu was open in my hands, and nobody had asked me what I wanted. This was also information. The dinner proceeded the way family dinners proceed when a family has decided to perform warmth rather than produce it. Stories were told. My cousins updated me on their children. Brenda described a renovation project at her house that had gone over budget in ways she found both outrageous and entertaining. Charles talked about his retirement. Ray, my father's brother, asked me about Seattle with the specific interested quality of someone who had been told to ask me about Seattle and was executing the instruction with genuine effort, if not genuine curiosity. Nobody mentioned the 3 years. Nobody mentioned the phone calls from March 2019. Nobody mentioned Todd's business venture, or the $38,000, or the word loyalty, or the phrase, "It's not like you're gonna miss it." Nobody mentioned that I had not seen most of these people in 3 years, and that the last interaction I had with several of them had been the specific kind of absence that communicates a position without requiring a statement. We were performing a family dinner that had no history. I participated in it the way I participate in any professional situation that requires me to be present and composed before I have full information, which is to say, I responded to what was directly addressed to me. I asked reasonable follow-up questions. I did not introduce anything that would change the temperature of the room before I understood the room. I also did not order anything. The waiter came to my side of the table twice in the first 40 minutes. The first time I said I was still looking. The second time I asked for water and said I would be ready shortly. My mother, from her end of the table, asked if I had seen the crab. She said it was wonderful. I said it looked great. I looked at my menu. I found the section I wanted. I noted the price. I ordered the salmon, $42, a glass of the house white, $16. I would not be finishing the wine. The salmon arrived approximately 20 minutes after I ordered it. By then, a fourth bottle of wine had been opened, and what appeared to be a fifth was being discussed at the far end of the table. Todd and his girlfriend had ordered additional appetizers. Two of my cousins had ordered desserts that were being pre-discussed with the waiter in the enthusiastic way of people who have already decided what they want before the savory course is finished. My father was on his second ribeye, or possibly his first, had been so large that the plate had simply been replaced. I was not tracking his food closely. I was tracking the table in aggregate, and the aggregate number was growing in the direction of a bill that was going to require a decision. I was thinking about that decision. I was also thinking about Sandra's question from 3 days earlier. What are you hoping to get from this? I had said I wanted to know if anything had changed. Sitting at that table, 45 minutes in, I had my answer. Nothing had changed. The invitation had been constructed exactly the way every financial interaction with my family had been constructed, with warmth on the surface and a different transaction underneath. The warmth was real, in the sense that my family genuinely enjoyed the kind of evening this was, genuinely liked being together in a nice place with good food and wine. The transaction was also real, in the sense that the evening had been organized around the assumption that someone else would pay for it. The someone was me. I had known this on some level from the moment the hostess said the rest of the party, and something had moved across her expression. I had stayed to confirm it. I had confirmed it. Now I needed to decide what to do. I want to explain the waiter situation carefully because I think the simplicity of what I did is the whole point, and I do not want to overdress it. Approximately 15 minutes before the check conversation started, I asked my waiter, his name was Derek, attentive without being intrusive, the specific professional quality of someone who has been doing this long enough to read a table accurately. I asked him if I could speak with him for a moment. He leaned down. I said 2 sentences quietly enough that the cousin to my left, who was engaged in a discussion about a home renovation, did not register that I had spoken. I said, please separate my meal from the group order and charge me only for what I personally ordered after I arrived. I said I'd like to settle my portion quietly whenever that's convenient. He looked at me for exactly 1 second. He nodded. He left. The family did not notice. The wine conversation continued. Todd was describing a restaurant in Bend he had recently discovered. My father was signaling for the 4th or 5th bottle. I ate my salmon. It was very good. The house white was adequate. The check conversation started the way I had known it would start. My father leaned back in his chair with the satisfied posture of a man at the end of an evening that has gone the way he planned. He looked at me across the table with the warmth that was real in the way I have described, genuine in its texture, constructed in its purpose. He said something I want to record precisely, because the phrasing had been chosen carefully. He said, "You're picking this up, right? Not you're paying. You're picking this up." The language of casual generosity, as though I had been the one who had organized this dinner, as though 17 people's consumption of king crab and premium ribeye and 4 bottles of wine had been my invitation rather than his. My mother, from her end, said, after all, "You're the successful one." It landed with the specific echo of every time that sentence had been used to transfer a cost to me. Not a compliment, a reclassification. My success reframed in real time as the reason a bill I had not generated belonged to me. My brother Todd did not say anything. He looked at his plate, and then at my father, and then at his plate again. the posture of someone who had been part of the planning of the evening and was now watching the execution, with the specific silence of a man who wants the outcome but does not want to be the one visibly asking for it. The table went quiet in the expectant way of a group that had been told, or had understood without being told, that a specific moment was arriving. I looked at my father. I did not argue. I did not explain. I did not perform the anger I was not actually feeling, because what I was feeling was not anger. It was the specific clarity of a person who has already made a decision and is watching the situation confirm it. I said, "Let me get the waiter." I raised my hand. Derek appeared within 30 seconds with the focused promptness of someone who had been watching for the signal. I said, "Derek, could you bring the check, please?" He said, "Of course." He said he would be right back. He left. My father settled back in his chair with the expression of a man who believed his daughter was about to pay $4,000 for a dinner he had organized in her name without her knowledge or consent. He looked, in that moment, completely certain. I have thought about that certainty many times since. The specific confidence of someone who has run a system so many times that they have stopped being able to imagine the system failing. My family had called me the emergency fund and the successful one, and the person who would understand for so many years that the script had become invisible to them. They were not performing confidence. They genuinely expected the outcome. Derek came back in approximately 8 minutes. He was carrying 2 folders. He set the smaller one in front of me without ceremony. He set the larger one in front of my father with the same neutral professionalism. He said he had separated the bills as requested. My father looked at the folder in front of him. Then he looked at the folder in front of me. Then he looked at Derek. Derek said the lady had requested separate billing for her personal order at the time she placed it, and that the remainder of the table's charges were on the main reservation. He said it the way professionals deliver information that is accurate and uncomfortable, directly, without apology, without the softening that would imply the information could be revised. My father opened his folder. I opened mine. My total, including the salmon, the glass of house white, and the tax on both, was $58. I put my card on the folder without looking at what was in my father's. I already knew approximately what was in my father's. I looked at the table instead. My mother's face had changed. The performance of warmth had been replaced by something that was trying to find a new configuration and hadn't located it yet. Todd was looking at his plate again. The cousin to my left had stopped talking about her renovation. The table had gone quiet in the way of a room in which a shared understanding has just been publicly revised. My father looked up from his folder. He looked at me. For the first time that evening, he did not look certain. My father looked at the folder for a long time, not reading it. He had read it. He was looking at it the way people look at something they understand completely and are trying to find a version of that does not mean what it means. There was no such version. The folder contained a bill for $4,112, covering the food and wine consumed by 17 people over approximately 2.5 hours. All of it ordered before I arrived, all of it traceable to a reservation made in my father's name, all of it his legal and financial responsibility in a way that my presence at the table did not change, and my departure would not change, and no amount of familial expectation could change. I signed my receipt. I put my card back in my wallet. My father looked up at me. He said, with the tone of a man who has not yet found the new script and is therefore using the old one, that he had thought we were doing this together. I said I had ordered what I ordered and paid for what I ordered. I said that was how I did things now. He looked at my mother. My mother's expression had moved through several configurations in the past 4 minutes and had not settled on one. She had the look of a woman who had organized something carefully and was now watching the organization fail in a public setting in front of people she would have to see again. The table did not recover its earlier energy. This is the accurate description of what happened in the 20 minutes following Derek's delivery of the 2 folders, and I think the accuracy matters more than drama here. There was no screaming. Nobody made a speech. Todd did not overturn anything. My mother did not cry, at least not in front of the table. What happened was quieter and in some ways more complete than any of those things. The table went quiet in the specific way of a group of people who have just received information that requires them to recalculate something they thought was settled. The extended family, Santa, the cousins, Brenda and Carl, Ray and Donna, Charles, the neighbors whose names I had not obtained. These were people who had come to a dinner at an expensive steakhouse on a Saturday evening because my parents had invited them and they had understood or assumed or been told something that made the evening feel available. They had ordered accordingly. King crab and premium steaks and 4 bottles of wine are the choices of people who believe the bill is someone else's problem. Now they were learning that the bill was my father's problem, and my father was looking at a folder with $4,000 in it and the expression of someone who had not fully modeled this outcome. My cousin on my left, the one who had been discussing her renovation project, leaned toward her husband and said something quiet. He looked at his plate. Brenda, my mother's sister, asked the waiter if it was possible to get separate checks. Derek said the table had been opened under a single reservation and the policy for private dining rooms was that the organizing party was responsible for the full account, but that he could provide an itemized breakdown if separate contributions needed to be arranged among the guests. Son. Brenda said she would like the itemized breakdown. Derek produced it from the secondary folder he had been carrying, which told me that the restaurant had anticipated this sequence. Here's what I want to tell you about the restaurant, because it is the piece of the evening that I had not anticipated, and that changed the texture of what happened. When Derek came to take my personal order, he had been efficient and professional in the way I described. What I did not know at the time, what I learned afterward from a brief conversation with the manager, was that my father had made a reservation at the same restaurant 14 months earlier, and had organized a similar dinner and had, at the conclusion of that evening, disputed the bill on the grounds that his daughter had agreed to pay and had then failed to do so. The dispute had been resolved in the restaurant's favor, which meant my father had paid. But the interaction had been documented, as the restaurant documented disputes, and the reservation had been flagged in their system in the quiet, procedural way that service businesses flag difficult accounts. When my father made a new reservation 6 weeks before this dinner, for a private room, for a party of 17, the system had flagged it. The staff had been briefed. Derek had been specifically assigned to the table. When I leaned toward Derek 45 minutes into the evening and said, "Please separate my meal from the group order," he had already been watching the table with the attention of someone who understood the shape of the evening and was prepared for exactly this request. He had not said anything to me about the prior incident. He was a professional. But the restaurant's preparation meant that the itemized breakdown was already printed, the private dining policy was already clear, and there was documentation, camera timestamps, reservation records, prior dispute files that established the organizing party's responsibility in a way that was not arguable. My father had tried this before, at this restaurant, with the same premise. The restaurant had been ready. My father's attempt to resolve the bill through the table's guests did not go the way he needed it to go. The itemized breakdown, distributed by Derek with the patient professionalism of someone who had done more difficult things than this in his career, showed the table's consumption in granular detail. Brenda and Carl had ordered 2 appetizers, 2 entrees, and had shared a bottle of wine with another couple at the table. Their portion was approximately $460, which was significant but not incomprehensible. Brenda said they had come because they were invited to a family dinner and had been under the impression it was a hosted event. She said this to my mother, directly, in the specific tone of a woman who is fond of her sister and is now in the position of being embarrassed in front of her husband and her children at a restaurant where she had consumed $460 on the assumption that someone else was managing the accounting. My mother said of course they would work it out. She had not meant for anyone to be put in an awkward position. Brenda said she and Carl would cover their portion, but she wanted it understood that this was not something she had expected. My mother said she understood. This conversation happened at one end of the table. A similar but shorter conversation was happening at the other end, where Ray and Donna had reached approximately the same conclusion through approximately the same process. Charles, the family friend, produced his wallet with the specific resigned efficiency of a man who has known my parents for 30 years and has updated his assessment of the evening with information that did not surprise him as much as it should have. The neighbors, the two people I had not recognized, had a quieter conversation with each other and then flagged Derek and asked if they could pay separately. Derek explained the policy again. They looked at each other. One of them produced a card. Todd sat through all of this without speaking. He had not produced his wallet. He had not engaged with the itemized breakdown. He was sitting with the specific stillness of someone who is hoping that enough time will pass, that the situation resolves itself without requiring his participation. My father said, "Todd, you need to contribute here." Todd said he had not brought enough to cover his portion. He said it quietly, but the table was quiet enough that several people heard it. The cousin to my left looked at her plate. I paid my bill while my father was in conversation with the manager. Derek had brought the payment terminal to my seat efficiently, as though he had been waiting for me to signal, and had processed my payment before any of the larger conversation reached its resolution. I put on my coat. I picked up my bag. I looked at the table one last time, not from anger, not from satisfaction, from the same instinct I have at the end of any project, which is to confirm that the situation is what I understand it to be before I leave it. The seafood tower was empty. The wine bottles were empty. The folder with $4,000 in it was still open in front of my father's place. My mother was speaking to Brenda in a low voice. Todd was looking at his phone. The extended family was in various stages of contribution and conversation, and the specific discomfort of people who had come to a celebration and were now in a negotiation. My plate was clear. My glass was empty. My receipt was signed. I said goodnight to the table in the general sense, not to anyone specifically, not with an announcement, just the word and a brief acknowledgement, and I walked toward the door, through the frosted glass panels and back through the dining room and out to the parking lot. It was cold in Portland in November, clear, the kind of dry November cold that feels honest compared to Seattle's damp. I sat in my car for a few minutes. I was not processing the evening. I had processed most of it at the table. In the calm, analytical way I process things that have confirmed what I already understood. What I was doing in those few minutes was something quieter and harder to name, something close to the feeling at the end of a very long project, when the deliverable has been submitted and the outcome is whatever it is, and the next thing is simply to go home. I texted Sandra. I said just one sentence, any sentence. They hadn't changed. She wrote back within 30 seconds. She said she was sorry and she wasn't surprised, and she was glad I had driven separately. I said, me too. I started the car and drove north on I-5 towards Seattle. The calls started the next morning, not from my father, from my mother, which told me something about the distribution of discomfort in the household, that my mother was the one who experienced the gap between the evening's intended outcome and its actual outcome as something that required management, and that my father was experiencing it as something he needed to wait out. She called 3 times before noon. I did not answer. She left 2 voicemails. The first voicemail said she hoped I understood that the dinner had been meant as a real attempt at reconnection, and that things had just gotten complicated. The second voicemail said she wanted me to know that my father was embarrassed and that she thought there were ways we could work through this as a family if I was willing to have a real conversation. I listened to both voicemails. I did not return them. Todd texted me on Sunday evening. His text said I could have just talked to them, He did not specify what I could have talked to them about or what outcome that conversation would have produced or how it would have addressed the structural fact of 17 people ordering $4,000 of food before I arrived. I did not respond. My cousin, the one who had been discussing her renovation, sent me a message on Monday. She said she was sorry about what had happened and that she hadn't known what the dinner was really about. She said she had paid her portion and that she hoped I was okay. I appreciated that message and told her so. I told her I was fine. She was the only one who asked. My mother called again 6 weeks later. This call was different from the Sunday voicemails in the same way the original October invitation call had been different from the March 2019 pressure calls. There was something in her voice that was not constructed, that reached past the performance of warmth into something smaller and more honest. She said she had been thinking about the dinner for 6 weeks. She said she understood that it had looked bad. I told her I did not think it had looked bad. I told her I thought it had looked like exactly what it was. She was quiet. I told her I wanted to say something that I had not said in March 2019 because I had been too tired to say it clearly and had chosen distance instead. She said she was listening. I told her that I had loved being part of the family when being part of the family meant something mutual, that I had given money and time and presence for years because I believed the giving was part of a relationship, not the condition of one. That the moment I understood it was the condition rather than the expression, the emergency fund comment at Thanksgiving, the "it's not like you're going to miss it" in March, the 17 people at a restaurant table ordering food before I arrived, was the moment the relationship had stopped being something I could participate in honestly. I told her I was not trying to punish them. I was not interested in the dinner as revenge. I had gone because she had asked me to come, and I had wanted to see if anything had changed. And I had paid for my own meal because that was simply how I handled things now, and the outcome of the evening was the outcome of decisions my father had made, not something I had engineered. She said she knew that. She said she had known it in the parking lot when she got in the car with my father after the dinner, and there had been a specific silence between them that she said had been worse than any argument. I asked her what she wanted from me. She was quiet for a moment. She said she did not know exactly. She said she thought she wanted the version of a relationship with her daughter that she had not been offering. She said she understood that saying this on a phone call was not the same as it being true over time. I told her I agreed with that. I told her the door was not closed. I told her that what it would take to open it was different from what had been offered so far, and that what it would take was not money or performance or a restaurant. It was the sustained, consistent evidence that she saw me as a person rather than a resource. I told her I was not holding my breath. I told her I hoped I was wrong to not hold it. She said she hoped so too. We hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a while after the call. I looked out the window at the Capitol Hill rooftops and at the edge of the Cumberland River if the light had been right, but it wasn't. It was a gray November evening, the kind Seattle produces in quantity, the river invisible behind low clouds. I thought about the dinner, about Derek appearing with 2 folders, about my father's face when he understood that the smaller folder was mine. I thought about 3 years of quiet in Seattle that I had built from nothing after walking away from the noise. I thought about the salmon, which had been very good. Here's what happened, plainly. My parents invited me to dinner after 3 years of no contact, told me it would be just the 3 of us, and seated me in a private room with 17 people who had been eating and drinking for over an hour before I arrived. My father asked if I was picking up the check. I had already asked Derek to separate my order. My bill was $58. My father's bill was $4,112, which he paid because the private dining policy assigned responsibility to the reservation holder and because the restaurant had a file on him from a prior attempt at the same maneuver. The extended family covered their portions with varying degrees of goodwill. Todd had not brought enough money. My mother called twice the next morning. I drove home that night. That is the whole story. Here's what I want to leave with you. My family did not change in those 3 years I was gone. I did not expect them to. Change of that kind is rare and slow and requires the person doing the changing to understand what needs changing, which requires them to have seen themselves accurately, which is the thing my family has never been able to do. What changed in those 3 years was me, not dramatically, not in the therapeutic sense of healing and transformation and arriving at a new self, in the simpler sense that I had spent 3 years not being the emergency fund and had discovered that my life without that role was quieter and cleaner and more mine than it had ever been, and that returning to the role, even for one dinner, was not something I was willing to do. The whisper was not clever. It was not strategy. It was the simplest possible expression of the simplest possible boundary. I will pay for what I choose, not for what I am assumed to absorb. $58 is not a statement. It is just what I ordered. The statement was the 3 years before the dinner and the drive home after it, and the life I have continued building in Seattle that does not require my family to see it correctly in order to be real. If you are the person in your family that everyone counts on when the bill comes, not just the restaurant bill, all the bills, I want you to hear this clearly. Your generosity is not a character flaw that needs correcting. It is a real thing about you, and it is possible to keep it without directing it at people who have reclassified it as a service they are entitled to receive. The right people will not need you to pay for dinner they ordered without asking you. They will not describe your success as the reason their choices are your responsibility. They will not need you to be the emergency fund in order to want you at the table. Find those people. Keep those people. Everyone else can settle their own account. Tell me your first name and your city in the comments. Tell me if you have ever been handed a bill for something you never ordered. Tell me if you finally said no, and if you want more nights like this one. The quiet ones, the ones where the satisfaction comes not from a speech, but from a simple decision made in advance of the moment it was needed. Come find us on the channel. There are stories there that will stop you mid-scroll, the kind that stay with you. Stories about people who finally stopped absorbing what was never theirs to carry. If this one found you tonight, those will too. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.